Good evening. You're on the smoking section with Steve Helfer. The show's been on about, I think we've been on about maybe 15 years now, mostly discussing issues related to tobacco and individual freedom and the integrity of science, particularly when that science is used to advocate for or against public policies, particular public policies. And tonight we're going to discuss some things related to the tobacco issues. I was reading recently a novel written by a medical doctor in Canada. He's a very famous novelist whose name escapes me at the moment. But one thing, he was giving advice to someone, and he said to the person, well, perhaps if you gave up smoking, you might live a few more years. But with those years, if you're depriving yourself of something that's a great comfort and a pleasure, would those few more years really be worthwhile? And of course, that's something everyone has to make up their own minds on. Of course, my own opinion is that many people who quit smoking not only deprive themselves of a great pleasure, but in fact don't add a few more years to their lives and don't get in better health. But even assuming, for the sake of argument, that you did, how many things in your present life, or do you want to give up tobacco so that you can extend your life? And a deprived life, a life where the pleasures and interests and comforts you have, you give up thinking that, well, you'll have a couple more years. That's a question people have to answer for themselves. But I think largely in our hyper-medicalized society, those questions are never talked about. I mean, the deprived life, the life where you don't eat what you want, and you don't smoke, etc. And instead of enjoying a coffee at a coffee house with friends, you're in the gym punishing yourself in front of a flat screen TV. You know, these are things that it seems our life is becoming very dry. Now, it's in, to digress a little, I was watching a program on New York City, and Ed Koch, and around who was mayor of New York City. I think he won the mayorship in about 1978, and at that point, New York City was riven with crime, non-functioning public services, low tax revenue, on the brink of bankruptcy, and Ed Koch was able to reverse that trend. By the way, without any kind of smoking restrictions. Those smoking restrictions didn't come until much later, I think, not until gosh, mid-90s, I guess. But at that point in the 70s and late 60s, New York was a very interesting place, and all kinds of artistic endeavors were going on, all kinds of music, yet there was a lot of crime. So it's kind of a balance, and I think New York is an interesting example of that balance. I think most people would say New York is a much more livable city at this point in time, no question about it, but I think it would also be agreed by almost everyone, it's a far less interesting city. And certainly with the ban of smoking and the truncation of personal liberty in that regard, the city is very dry. The bars, the jazz clubs, all of that stuff are not nearly as fervently, are not nearly as fruitful as they were when people had a bit more freedom. In our Facebook page today, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, I hope everyone who is interested in this issue gives us a like on Facebook, friends us, I think you say, likes us. It has come out that even in the European Union, which of course is very, very influenced by the World Health Organization and so forth, managers of stock portfolios or mutual funds and that sort of thing have been very resistant to the pressures of non-governmental organizations and such to blacklist tobacco stocks. And the managers of these mutual funds have said that their first duty is to give stockholders a return on their money, and evidently, even though the tobacco industry throughout the world, like smokers, is besieged, they are able to maintain a profit. And again, this is something that I think is good news. They are not, God willing, at this point, driving the tobacco industry out of business. So those of us who enjoy tobacco, who find comfort in tobacco, and to whom tobacco is a very important part of their lives, people are still growing it, processing it, importing and exporting it, and selling it. Despite the anti-smoking Nazis, who are mostly centered, or to a large degree centered in the World Health Organization, they are probably very unhappy about this, but it makes me very happy, and it shows how difficult it is to separate humankind from tobacco, a plant that has been here and been associated with mankind for 8,000 years, and even with marshaling every kind of form of coercion, including unreasonable restrictions, social stigmatizations, predatory taxation, workplace discrimination, housing discrimination, massive propaganda campaigns, restriction of free speech, to wit, making movies with images of smoking, or allowing tobacco companies to put their logo on baseball caps or whatnot. Even with that, human beings all over the world are still enjoying tobacco and still patronizing tobacco companies. And as is noted on our tobacco and our Facebook page, it reminds me very much of a quote that was in the New York Times, where a tobacco farmer, I believe in Virginia, or one of the 5 tobacco growing states, told the New York Times that tobacco is a golden weed, and weeds are very, very hard to kill. So even when you have these massive global organizations like the World Health Organization, and they are backed up with wealthy people like Michael Bloomberg and Bill and Melinda Gates, using tax-exempt foundations, bankrolling these anti-smoking activists, using their foundations and their foundations' money, which, by the way, are tax-exempt, so that, in a sense, they are being subsidized by us taxpayers, because they don't pay taxes on these foundations. It allows people like Bill and Melinda Gates and Michael Bloomberg to use their money in an even more effective way than they would normally have, to influence public policy. And in that way, it kind of circumvents the democratic process, because the legislatures instead of being influenced by individual human beings and citizenry, the little people, are exposed to a massive amount of pressure from these foundations, and very often they're using them to harass tobacco companies and to impose ever more restrictions on smokers and ever higher taxes. And in addition to that, they advocate for the loss of freedom of speech, meaning that a tobacco company loses its logo, can't advertise, that a film director is penalized by the rating system if he or she includes an image of smoking. This is censorship on a global level, being promoted by something like the World Health Organization and being funded by or helped along by these very, very powerful foundations. At Harvard, there's an institute called the Safra Institute, which has recently changed its name. At least it's my opinion. It used to be the Safra Institute on institutional corruption, run by a man named Larry Lessig, who, and usually most of their leanings, of course, are anti-business. You know, it's always like this, how corrupt this organization, this business is, or that business is. Of course, they never turn themselves on their academic business, on academia. And it usually is a pretty politically correct organization. Nonetheless, I think it's an organization that has promoted freedom of speech and certainly does allow anyone who wishes to be critical of it and critical of its speakers to go there and to speak without any kind of restraint, which I find laudable. And again, I think Larry Lessig is well intended, and but we are fortunate in Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights because a Harvard graduate who is, a Harvard undergraduate is now working on a project there, and he is getting grant money, and amazingly enough, he is sympathetic to our point of view. He is a tobacco user. He does like, I think it's snus that he uses, and he wrote what's called a status report on his project, which I think has some really interesting stuff in it, and I'm very impressed how quickly he has come up to speed in terms of many things related to the tobacco wars. Although, of course, he and I haven't spoken a lot, but there were some things I, of course, disagree with him. But the title of his project, I think, is 18 going on 21, Nicotine, Neuroscience, Freedom and Policy. Now, you know, we're hearing a lot about neuroscience these days, and I find it very interesting. And again, I believe this was on our Facebook page. There was recently an article written by one of the New York Times science writers about a study which appears to show that 70% of the conclusions that neuroscientists have come up with in the last 20 years, with all the hoopla attached to neuroscience, are wrong, based on faulty methodology in their research. So this is becoming critical because neuroscientists are insinuating themselves, just as scientists like to do in general, in public policy. So, for example, they're saying that, oh, the adolescent brain isn't fully formed and that nicotine could have a harmful effect on it. I mean, if that isn't the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard, I mean, You take people like Winston Churchill, Mark Twain, Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, some of the greatest minds of our history, of human history, certainly in the last few centuries, have used tobacco in a tremendous way, and certainly their minds were very, very clear and sharp up until their very, very old age. Like someone again like Bertrand Russell, who is one of the most renowned mathematicians and philosophers of the of the 20th century, and Winston Churchill, who was a great orator as well as a tremendous leader in the Second World War. So, I mean, if nicotine, I mean, it just completely defies any kind of experiential wisdom that people should have. But still, it is something that is to be considered. Now, one thing that Mr. Sanchez, the name of the student who I hope that we can have a very fruitful association with and can weigh in against him, is he quotes Simon Chapman, who's one of the world's most foremost anti-smoking activists. But I do have to give Professor Chapman credit that in some ways he is very, very critical of the anti-smoking movement. One way in particular is that he has very vociferously attacked the kind of pseudoscience that talks about third-hand smoke, the kind of political abuse that promotes employment discrimination against smokers, outside smoking bans, and one way that he was very, very sympathetic to the rights of smokers is particularly when it comes to those persons who are in mental facilities and how much their autonomy is being compromised by people telling them, well, you're here because you're schizophrenic or because you're having an extreme nervous breakdown, but we're not going to let you smoke because 30 or 40 years of smoking might elevate your risk of X, Y, or Z. In the meantime, you're having a nervous breakdown. So I think Professor Chapman should get credit where credit is due, but he says, Professor Chapman, and Mr. Sanchez takes it without much criticism, at least in this paper, that somehow the tobacco industry has corrupted science. And I think there is really very little evidence to that. I don't think that the tobacco industry has corrupted science anywhere near to the extent that the anti-smoking groups have, or maybe especially the Surgeon General. But one thing that Chapman, I think it's Chapman, accuses several things. He accuses the tobacco industry of funding and publishing research that supports its position. Well, I don't see how how anyone can be critical of the tobacco industry for that. There's all kinds of funding going for people who are attacking tobacco, and if it funds good science that supports its position, if it's good science and it may not be a politically correct conclusion that is reached, I think the tobacco industry should be congratulated on funding that. He also criticizes the tobacco industry for criticizing research that does not support it. Well, this defies the whole idea of science, that the way science progresses is for people to be skeptical of it and to look at its flaws, not to kind of unquestionably accept it. And as a matter of fact, Professor Michael Siegel feels that to a large extent, because the tobacco industry since 1998 has refrained from criticizing anti-smoking science, that the science itself has, almost in Professor Siegel's words, gone off the rails. So that's another attack or accusation which I don't think the tobacco industry has any reason to be apologetic for. And then he also says disseminating information directly to policymakers and public health. Well, no, that's I can't see what's wrong with that at all. I mean, whom should the tobacco industry disseminate their information to, especially when the anti-smoking movement has been so, they'll send out a press release before the paper will even be published or peer-reviewed. And because it makes such a good story, how mankind has been nursing a viper to its breast for 400 years, to wit, tobacco. The newspapers love to print that, the press loves to print that, just because it's an interesting story. And so I don't think the tobacco industry, for any of those reasons that Simon Chapman says, is guilty of corrupting science. I have looked at this issue for 20 years. I have not looked at it as carefully as some, but I have not seen any evidence of it. I do think probably I've heard accusations, but I haven't seen any real hard evidence, even looking at the millions of tobacco documents that have been released to the public. Another thing that Mr. Sanchez he talks about two other things that I think are really interesting and that I kind of never thought of. One that I never thought of is you have the American Legacy Foundation, which is something that is, again, one of these faux nonprofits, been set up by oodles of money that usually is taken from smokers or comes from these foundations, which are really not necessarily dedicated to improving the lot of mankind. To a large extent, they're dedicated to the exercise of power by these people. But Mr. Sanchez, the Harvard student, points out that how can, when the legacy funds a scientific project, how can the scientists say that there is no conflict of interest when the Legacy Foundation, quote, is dedicated to making tobacco use a thing of the past, end of quote. Clearly, there is a strong funding bias here that while the methodology might be perfect, we do live in an era when when it is considered ethical for any possible conflict of interest to appear along with the research. So this is something Justin Sanchez has pointed out, which I think is very important. And the last thing that he points out in this paper, this so-called status report, that I thought was very interesting, is the idea of banning. The original idea of banning smoking was supposed to be to protect people from secondhand smoke. But now, for example, there is a big move to ban the use of smokeless tobacco, chewing tobacco, in public stadiums by baseball players, simply because they want to prevent the baseball players from what they say is setting a bad example for the youth. And while you might say that someone has an ethical duty to set a good example for young people, particularly if that person is a public figure like a baseball player or a movie actor, but is it reasonable or ethical to base actual legislation on the idea that we are going to make that person set a good example, and we are going to punish the person by law, fine that person, fire that person? Again, this is something that is now being used to justify outdoor smoking bans. They've given up the secondhand smoke thing, and now they're saying, well, we're going to ban smoking in public parks because if Cambridge youth see Steve Helfer walking in Cambridge Common with a cigar, they're going to emulate him, and in 50 or 60 years, it might elevate their risk of X, Y, or Z. Certainly, does this mean that City Council, for example, should impose upon its citizens not only an ethical duty, but actually fine them if they don't set good examples? So these are all issues that are very interesting, and I think permeate the whole tobacco war. And again, I hope Justin Sanchez and Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights has a very fruitful association. Thanks for watching. Please tune in next Wednesday.